What is this? You really think I laid hands on her?
Dylan, keep your hands where I can see them. Step away from your weapon.
Come on, you know me, bro.
Okay, just breathe with me, all right?
He hit me.
Focus on me, Dylan. Hands up. Let me see them. They're up.
Imagine you are a police officer. Your job is to catch bad people and keep everyone safe. But one day, you get a phone call that changes everything. You find out that a woman is being physically hurt, and the person hurting her isn't a typical criminal. He is a member of your own team, a deputy at the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office. This is the ultimate betrayal of the badge. It is a moment where the people sworn to protect the public have to turn around and investigate one of their own. The thin blue line is about to be tested. Will the department protect a colleague, or will they do what is right and save a victim from a predator hiding in plain sight? This is the story of a rescue that started inside the station walls. The sun was shining brightly over the parking lot, but the air felt heavy and cold as Sergeant Silas Reed and Detective Jackson Miller walked toward a specific vehicle. They weren't looking for a typical criminal, they were looking for one of their own. Standing by his car was Deputy Brody West, a young man who looked like any other officer ready for his shift. As the investigators got closer, the atmosphere became tense. West looked up, his expression changing from calm to confused as he saw his superiors approaching him with serious faces. Sergeant Reed didn't waste any time. He called out to West, calling him buddy to keep things professional but firm. West was on his phone, but he quickly hung up as the officers surrounded him. Reed explained that they were there because some very serious allegations had been made regarding domestic violence. You could see the shock on West's face as he realized this wasn't a friendly chat. The investigators made it clear that they needed to hear his side of the story, but it had to happen at the office, not out in the open where everyone could see. The weight of the situation started to sink in as they prepared to move from the public parking lot into the high-stakes environment of a criminal investigation. As the three men moved toward the shade of the building, the professional bond they once shared began to vanish. Sergeant Reed's voice was calm, but his words were heavy with authority as he looked at Brody West. Because this was now a criminal investigation involving violence, the very weapon that defined West's job, his firearm, had to be removed. Sergeant Reed reached out and told West clearly, "Because you got a firearm, I'm going to take it." The parking lot was quiet as West handed over his weapon, a moment that felt like he was losing his power and his identity as a deputy. Detective Miller stood nearby, watching West's hands carefully to make sure there were no other hidden knives or weapons. Even though they were all co-workers, the investigators treated West with the same caution they would use for any other suspect. They checked his pockets and made sure he was secure, explaining that he knew exactly how this process worked. Disarming him wasn't just about safety, it was the moment West realized he was no longer the one in control, he was the one being caught. The investigators made sure Brody West understood that this was not a casual conversation between friends. Sergeant Reed looked him in the eyes and explained that they never want to listen to just one side of a story. However, because the claims were so serious, they were required to treat this as a formal criminal investigation. This meant that every word West said could be used as evidence, and every action he took would be watched closely. Reed called himself a truth seeker, explaining that his only goal was to find out exactly what happened. He told West that cooperation would go a long way, but he also reminded him that as a law enforcement officer, West already knew exactly how these rules worked. The friendly buddy talk from earlier began to fade away, replaced by the cold reality of police procedure. Even though they worked for the same office, the investigators were now the law, and West was the subject they were investigating. To keep things quiet and professional, the investigators decided not to take Brody West to the office in a regular patrol car with loud sirens and bright lights. Sergeant Reed told West they would use an unmarked vehicle to be discreet. This was a small act of professional courtesy, but it didn't change the fact that West was no longer driving himself, he was being transported like any other person under investigation. As they walked toward the unmarked car, Sergeant Reed reminded West that being honest and cooperative would be very helpful. West agreed, saying that he also believed in finding the truth. Before West could get into the car, another detective checked him one more time to be completely sure he didn't have any hidden weapons. Even though they were trying to be respectful, the message was clear: once they reached the office, the time for professional favors would be over, and the hard questions would begin. Inside the station, the focus shifted to Maya Thorne. She sat in a quiet room, but the air felt heavy with her silence. Sergeant Reed spoke to her gently, explaining that they were there because they were worried about her safety. He mentioned that other members of the department had seen her injuries and were concerned. Even though the evidence was right there on her body, Maya didn't want to admit what was happening. When the investigators asked her about the trip she took to the hospital or the marks on her face, Maya's answer was short and firm, no. She told the officers that she had nothing to say about the injury and didn't think the sheriff's office needed to be involved. It was a frustrating moment for the investigators. They knew she was hurting, but Maya was building a wall of silence to protect the very person who had caused her pain. She insisted that nothing criminal was going on, trying to convince the officers and perhaps herself that she was perfectly safe. As the interview continued, the silence in the room became even more uncomfortable. Sergeant Reed leaned in, trying to understand why a woman who had been hurt so badly was choosing to say nothing. He knew that Maya wasn't just afraid of Brody West, she was afraid for him. She wasn't worried about her own safety as much as she was worried about his future. Maya finally admitted that her biggest concern was that Brody might lose his career because of what was happening. She knew that if she spoke the truth, the man she lived with would no longer be a deputy. He would lose his job, his reputation, and his freedom. To her, protecting his badge felt more important than protecting her own life. This fear of the future kept her trapped, as she worried about how he would react once the truth finally came out. It was a heavy burden for her to carry, and the investigators could see that her loyalty to her abuser was the strongest wall they had to break. Sergeant Reed could see that Maya was trapped in a very difficult spot. He knew that victims of abuse often stay because they feel they have no other choice or nowhere else to go. He looked at her kindly and made a very important promise. He told her that she didn't have to go back to a house where she felt unsafe. He said, "We can get you help tonight," making it clear that the sheriff's office had resources to keep her and her children protected from any more violence. The investigators explained that her safety was their biggest concern, even bigger than the criminal case against Brody West. They offered to help her find a safe place to stay and to provide police protection so she wouldn't have to live in fear anymore. Even though Maya still felt unsure and said no to the help at that moment, the offer was always on the table. The officers wanted her to know that the department wasn't just there to arrest a deputy, they were there to save a life. Since Maya was too afraid to speak, the investigators had to find someone who would. They called in Lieutenant Karen Boyd, who was Rebecca's supervisor at the sheriff's office. The room felt very serious as Sergeant Reed prepared to take her official statement. Before she could say a single word about what she saw, Reed had to place her under oath. He asked her to swear that everything she was about to say would be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Lieutenant Boyd answered clearly, "I do." This was a major turning point in the story. By putting her under oath, her words became legal evidence that could be used in court to hold Brody West accountable. The blue wall of silence was finally starting to crack because one officer was brave enough to tell the truth about another. Lieutenant Boyd adjusted her position, her face showing how much this conversation hurt to have. She began to tell the investigators about the many times she had seen marks on Maya over the last few weeks. The first thing she remembered clearly was a black eye. It was a shocking sight for a professional workplace, and it stayed in the lieutenant's mind as a major warning sign that something was very wrong at home. She explained that she had seen the injury about 4 weeks ago. At first, Maya didn't want to talk about how it happened. It was only much later, during a quiet moment before a work shift, that the truth started to come out. Lieutenant Boyd had finally asked Maya directly if Brody was the one who gave her that black eye, and Maya had simply nodded her head yes. This was the first piece of evidence that proved the violence wasn't just a one-time accident, but a pattern of abuse. The investigation took a darker turn as Lieutenant Boyd continued her statement under oath. Beyond the visible bruising, she revealed a much more serious and hidden injury that Maya had mentioned. Maya had confessed to her supervisor that she was suffering from a busted eardrum. This piece of information changed the way the investigators looked at the case. A black eye is a sign of a strike, but a ruptured eardrum shows a level of force that is incredibly dangerous and potentially life-altering. When Lieutenant Boyd had asked Maya directly if Brody West was the one responsible for this specific injury, Maya again confirmed the truth. It was becoming clear to everyone in the room that the violence inside the home was escalating, moving from surface-level marks to internal injuries that could cause permanent damage. The interview with Lieutenant Boyd grew even more intense as she described the other injuries she had seen on Maya. While the black eye was obvious, it was the smaller, more specific marks that told a deeper story of what was happening behind closed doors. Lieutenant Boyd explained that while they were out together, she noticed several dark bruises on Maya's arms and shoulders. The investigators listened closely as the lieutenant described the shape of these marks. They weren't just random bruises from a fall, they looked like fingerprints, as if someone had grabbed Maya's arm with incredible force. These fingerprint bruises were a clear sign of a physical struggle and suggested that Maya was being restrained or moved against her will. To the experienced investigators, these marks were a chilling piece of physical evidence that supported the claims of a highly abusive relationship. It was no longer just about one or two bad moments, it was a clear pattern of someone using their hands to hurt and control another person. As the investigators listened to Lieutenant Boyd, they began to understand the invisible chains holding Maya in that house. It wasn't just fear or loyalty keeping her there, it was a cold, hard contract. During their private conversations, Lieutenant Boyd had asked Maya if she had somewhere else to go or if she planned on leaving the deputy who was hurting her. Maya's answer revealed a heartbreaking reality that many victims face. She told the lieutenant that she felt she couldn't leave until their apartment lease was finished in December. To Maya, the legal document she had signed felt like a cage she couldn't escape without causing more trouble. She was worried about the money and the rules of the lease, even while she was suffering from serious physical injuries. This lease trap showed the investigators that the abuse wasn't just physical, it was a situation where the victim felt she had no choice but to stay until a date on a piece of paper told her she was free. Even though Maya was too afraid to speak to the investigators, the truth could not stay hidden forever. Lieutenant Boyd described the moment the wall of silence finally came down. It happened right before a work shift, around 6:30 in the evening. Maya had come into work and was sitting right next to the lieutenant. The atmosphere was quiet, and for a moment, the fear wasn't as strong as the need to be heard. Lieutenant Boyd didn't let the moment pass. She looked at Maya and asked her directly if Brody was the one who gave her the black eye. Instead of making an excuse or looking away, Maya simply shook her head yes. When the lieutenant asked if he was also responsible for the busted eardrum she had suffered a few weeks earlier, Maya admitted to that as well. In that quiet conversation, Maya finally confessed to 3 separate incidents of violence. She wasn't asking for the police to come, and she wasn't trying to get Brody in trouble, but by telling her supervisor the truth, she had finally provided the evidence needed to stop the abuse. The detectives now had everything they needed. While Maya Thorne had stayed silent to protect Brody West's career, the sworn statement from Lieutenant Boyd changed the game. The investigators reviewed the evidence of the black eye, the busted eardrum, and the finger-shaped bruises. They looked at the timeline of events and realized these weren't just accidents, they were criminal acts. Even though the victim didn't want to press charges, the law required the officers to act because the injuries were so severe. Sergeant Reed and Detective Miller gathered all the statements and evidence to finalize the case. They determined there was probable cause, which is a legal way of saying they had enough proof to make an arrest for a serious crime. The decision was made, the badge would no longer protect Brody West from the consequences of his actions. The time for talk was over. After gathering all the evidence and statements, the investigators moved forward with the arrest. On July 20th, the day after the initial investigation began, authorities located Dylan Brody West and took him into custody. The very man who used to walk through the jail doors to work as a guard was now walking through them as a prisoner. He was officially charged with felony domestic battery. As the booking process began, West had to go through the same steps he had watched so many others take. He was photographed, fingerprinted, and placed into a cell in the Charlotte County Jail. The uniform and the authority he once had were gone. By the end of the night, the man who was supposed to uphold the law was sitting behind bars, waiting to face a judge for the violence he had hidden behind his badge. The fallout from the arrest was swift and absolute. In the law enforcement world, trust is the foundation of the badge, and Brody West had shattered that trust. Sheriff Bill Prummel did not hesitate. As soon as the felony charges were confirmed, the administrative process moved into high gear. West wasn't just a man in a cell, he was now a liability to the integrity of the entire sheriff's office. By the following morning, the decision was official. Brody West was terminated. He was stripped of his credentials, his remaining gear was seized, and his name was scrubbed from the active duty roster. The department released a firm statement reinforcing that no one, regardless of their position or who they work for, is above the law. For West, the career he had once feared losing was gone, replaced by a looming legal battle and a permanent mark on his record. This case serves as a stark reminder of the Truth Seeker protocol. Even when a victim is too afraid to speak, the pattern of physical evidence and the courage of witnesses can bring the truth to light.